The night was heavy with the scent of magnolia and blood. Beneath a sky veiled in smoke, a man once bound in chains stood over his master's lifeless body, breathing slow, eyes unblinking. His name was Moses. History would call him a murderer. The land would call him its ruler. In the heart of antebellum Louisiana stood the Godfrey estate, a sprawling plantation that glimmered by day and groaned by night. The cypress trees swayed like mourners, their roots clutching at the damp earth as if trying to hold down the secrets buried beneath. The slaves whispered of the river that ran red after storms, of cries that echoed through the sugarcane at midnight. Among them was Moses, tall, broad-shouldered, and silent. To the overseers, he was just another tool. To the others, he was something more, a man whose eyes carried defiance, whose silence felt like thunder waiting to break. The master, Charles Godfrey, had inherited both the land and its cruelty. His cruelty was refined, precise, methodical, and always accompanied by a smirk. He believed control was his birthright and pain his language. Moses learned to read pain well. He saw it in the trembling hands of the women, in the hollow laughter of the men after long days in the fields. And he waited. Every lash, every insult, every humiliation sank deeper into his memory, like ink bleeding into paper. But what no one knew was that Moses had been educated in secret. The late Mrs. Godfrey, a fragile woman with kind eyes, had taught him letters when he was just a boy. After her death, the house changed. The master's temper grew wild, and the walls seemed to absorb every scream. By 1847, the air itself had turned sour. Rumors of rebellion spread through the plantations. Songs were sung in the fields, songs that carried more than melody. They carried intent. Moses stood at the center of it, saying little, observing much. And then came the night when the air cracked like a whip. A dispute over a missing tool became an accusation. An accusation became a beating. But this time Moses did not bow. When the whip rose, so did the knife. The candlelight flickered against blood-splattered walls as silence swallowed the room. Charles Godfrey, the master of the plantation, lay dead. And Moses, the man born to serve, stood free for the first time. But freedom, as he would learn, carries its own kind of chains. Would you have stopped him? Or joined him? The next morning, dawn crept over the plantation like an intruder afraid to be seen. The master's body had already been buried, quietly, without prayer. The widow Eleanor Godfrey ordered it so. Her face remained pale, her voice calm, but her eyes told another story. Rumors began to stir among the slaves. Some said she had gone mad. Others claimed she was relieved. Moses, now a man both feared and revered, was summoned to the main house. The servants watched as he entered, no longer through the back door, but the front. Inside, the air was thick with the scent of roses and rot. Eleanor sat by the window, dressed in black lace, her fingers trembling as they traced the rim of a teacup. "You did what I could never do," she said softly. "But now you must live with it." There was no accusation in her tone, only understanding, and something else, something that blurred the line between fear and fascination. She saw in Moses not just a man, but a force, something primal, untamed, inevitable. Days turned into weeks. The local sheriff came once, asked questions, then left, convinced that the master had fallen from his horse. Money and silence had always worked well in the South. Eleanor kept both close. Yet within the grand halls of the plantation, something unnatural began to unfold. Moses stayed close, at first as protector, then as confidant, then as something neither of them dared to name. At night, the candles burned longer. Their conversations grew deeper, their glances heavier. The other slaves whispered that the mistress had made a pact with the devil. And perhaps in some quiet way she had. When she finally placed her hand over his, it was not out of affection, but surrender. The plantation had changed hands that night, though no papers were signed. From that moment forward, the lines between servant and master dissolved. And as the cicadas screamed in the distance, Moses realized that the blood he had spilled was only the beginning. If you were her, would you have turned him in or let him stay? The day Moses married Eleanor Godfrey, the air refused to move. Even the birds seemed to fall silent, as though nature itself feared what was about to happen. The plantation workers stood in uneasy rows outside the main house, their faces blank, their eyes lowered. None dared to speak. A slave marrying a white widow. It was a sin so vast it might have split heaven itself. Inside, the ceremony was small and cold. The preacher, paid in gold and silence, spoke with trembling lips. His hand shook as he opened his Bible, knowing every word he spoke might damn him. Eleanor wore her mourning gown, the same black lace she had worn at her husband's funeral. Moses wore the master's old coat, fitted to his broad frame, still faintly smelling of the man he had killed. When they exchanged vows, a gust of wind broke through the parlor window, scattering petals and dust. For a moment, Eleanor's veil lifted, and she looked at Moses not with fear, but something dangerously close to admiration. There was no love here, not the kind the world preached. But there was understanding, and that was its own kind of bond. Afterward, they dined alone. The servants refused to enter. Outside, the slaves huddled in silence, whispering prayers under their breath. Inside, two worlds, black and white, master and slave, had fused under candlelight and blood. That night, the plantation held its breath. From the fields came no songs, no laughter, no sound at all. Only the slow hum of crickets and the crackle of firewood filled the silence. Moses stood by the window, staring into the endless rows of cane glowing under the moon. "They'll come for us," he said quietly. Eleanor sipped her wine and replied, "Then let them come." By dawn, rumors had reached neighboring estates. They called it witchcraft, madness, a mockery of God's law. But the sheriff never came. Fear was a powerful barrier, and Moses' reputation had grown into something almost supernatural. Weeks later, a strange calm settled over the Godfrey lands. The overseers obeyed Moses without question. The workers looked to him as both savior and curse. Even Eleanor seemed both queen and prisoner in her own mansion. The South had never seen such a union, a widow bound to her former slave. But beneath the silence of that marriage lay something far darker, a hunger for control, a yearning for vengeance, and a history that refused to stay buried. If love was forbidden, would you still choose it, knowing it could burn the world? By the summer of 1848, the Godfrey plantation no longer belonged to the Godfreys. It belonged to Moses, though no document bore his name. Power had a way of shifting quietly in the South, like a snake gliding through grass. The widow still signed the papers, but every command, every decision, every breath of the estate moved through Moses. The transformation was subtle, but complete. The overseers who once spat at him now tipped their hats when he passed. The same men who had beaten slaves for years now took orders from the man they once called property. The field still bore sugarcane, but it was fear that grew tallest. Moses ruled differently. He did not whip, he did not shout. His authority was colder, silent, absolute. One word from him could free a man, or disappear him. The slaves respected him, but they also feared him. Some whispered that the blood of the master had cursed him, that his soul had been branded when he spilled that first life. Eleanor watched him from the veranda, her eyes hidden behind a black veil. Their marriage was one of proximity, not passion. At night, they rarely spoke, though the silence between them was heavy with unspoken truths. She had once been a woman bound by society. Now she was bound by consequence. Visitors came, planters, merchants, and curious neighbors. They left quickly, unsettled by the strange order of things. "A black overseer?" one muttered. "No," another corrected. "A black master." Word spread like fire through the parishes. Some admired him as a symbol of impossible defiance. Others saw him as an omen, a warning of what could come if the old order ever broke. But power once tasted demands more. Moses began buying land through hidden means, trades conducted in the names of freedmen, signed with trembling hands. He expanded the plantation, turned profit, and paid debts no one thought he could understand. Yet with every acre he gained, the nights grew darker. Strange sounds echoed in the cane fields, footsteps with no source, whispers and voices long dead. The workers spoke of the old master's ghost wandering near the slave quarters, dragging chains across the mud. One morning a servant found blood smeared on the main house door, a symbol carved into it that no one could explain. Moses stared at it for a long time and said nothing, but deep inside, he felt what everyone else feared to admit. The plantation was waking up. Do you believe the dead can forgive? Or do they only wait for revenge? The nights grew restless after the blood appeared on the door. Even the wind seemed to carry whispers, soft, wet sounds that rippled through the cane like the sighs of the condemned. Workers began refusing to stay out past dusk. Fires were lit in the quarters, prayers whispered in Creole and broken English, charms hung from the trees. Something had turned in the soil itself. something no man could command. The first to vanish was Samuel, the field hand who claimed he saw the old master. Near the riverbank. He was found the next morning half submerged in the shallows, his face pale and his eyes open toward the gray sky. No one dared touch him. His mouth had been filled with cane leaves, pressed in until his jaw locked shut. Moses ordered the burial himself, his expression unreadable. "This land is ours now," he said quietly to the trembling crowd, "and the dead will learn to rest." But even he felt it. The air growing thick, the insects dying off, the sudden stillness that came each night before the frogs began to scream. Eleanor drifted through the house like a ghost herself. Her health had started to fade. Sleepwalking, speaking to shadows, her voice echoing through the halls long after she'd gone silent. Once Moses found her standing in the old master's study, running her fingers over the blood-stained floorboards. "Do you ever dream of him?" she whispered. "He doesn't leave me." By the end of that summer, the workers began to flee. Families disappeared in the night, leaving their tools in the fields. The ones who stayed kept to themselves, building small fires and drawing symbols in ash. A Haitian woman named Marianne, known for her knowledge of spirits, came to Moses one night and told him plainly, "The land remembers the whip. It remembers who fed it blood. It will not let go." But Moses would not listen. He had clawed power from the grave itself. He would not surrender it to ghosts. Still, when the windows rattled at midnight and footsteps creaked in empty rooms, even he began to wonder if the past was truly buried. Then one night, Eleanor awoke to the sound of whispering outside her door. She rose, candle in hand, and saw muddy footprints leading down the hall, large, bare, and fresh. They led straight to Moses's room. "If the dead returned for you, would you open the door?" The night the fire began, the moon was nowhere to be found. The fields stretched out in black silence, the cane swaying without wind. Inside the main house, Eleanor awoke to the smell of smoke before she saw the glow. When she looked out her window, the horizon was burning, orange flames licking at the sky, smoke rising like a curse. Moses was already outside, shirtless, his body glistening with sweat and soot. He shouted orders, directing men with buckets, but the fire moved like it had purpose. A living thing, devouring every stalk, every inch of soil that once yielded profit. Sparks caught on the roof of the sugar mill, and by dawn, nothing remained but charred earth and silence. They said it started near the old whipping post, the same place where Moses had once taken his last beating before turning the knife on the master. Some swore they saw a figure standing there in the smoke, watching. Others claimed they heard laughter, low, cruel, and unmistakably familiar. The overseers fled that same day, taking horses and rifles. Only the slaves remained, not because they were loyal, but because they had nowhere left to go. The plantation, once a kingdom of control, had become a ruin haunted by memory and ash. Moses stood at the edge of the blackened fields as the wind shifted, carrying the scent of burnt sugar and something far worse, decay. Eleanor came to stand beside him, her face streaked with soot, her eyes hollow. "He's not done," she said softly. "You can feel it, can't you?" Moses didn't answer. He stared at the smoldering ruins, the heat rising around him like judgment. For the first time since that night of murder, he felt small. Not powerless, but marked. The land he had conquered was rejecting him. That night, Eleanor refused to sleep in the main house. She moved to the servants' quarters, claiming the walls whispered when she tried to rest. Moses stayed behind. Alone, he walked the corridors, his footsteps echoing against the empty halls. The portraits seemed to watch him. The smell of smoke never left. When he reached the parlor, he found something impossible. The chair where the master had died, standing upright again, though no one had touched it in months. And on its seat, burned into the wood, was a single handprint. Moses touched it and felt warmth. "Would you believe in ghosts? If they burned your world to ash?" By autumn, Eleanor's mind began to unravel. The fire had left her fragile, a pale reflection of the woman who once held the entire parish in quiet awe. She wandered the halls in her morning gown, whispering to the walls, tracing her fingers over the soot-streaked wallpaper as if reading some invisible scripture. Moses tried to ignore it at first, her nightly murmurs, the way she called out the dead man's name in her sleep. But when he found her standing in the parlor one dawn, clutching a blood-stained letter, he could no longer look away. She turned toward him slowly, eyes wide, pupils dilated as if she'd been staring into the dark too long. "Do you know what he told me before he died?" she asked, voice trembling. "He said the land was cursed, that it would belong to whoever loved it most, and that love, Moses, can be a kind of death." She handed him the letter. The ink was faded, the paper brittle, yet the handwriting was unmistakably the master's. It wasn't a will, but a confession, a letter meant for her, never sent. In it, Charles Godfrey admitted what the plantation had been built upon: stolen graves, desecrated ground. The foundation stones of the main house had been taken from an old burial mound. The wealth that fed their empire came from soil soaked not just in blood but in bones. Eleanor began to weep. "He thought he owned this place," she whispered. "But it owns all of us. It feeds on us." That night the wind howled through broken shutters. The old piano in the drawing room began to play, though no one touched it. The same song the master once demanded at dinner. Moses stood in the doorway staring into the dark as the keys moved by themselves. When the final note echoed, Eleanor's voice broke the silence. "I helped him," she said. "When he beat them, when he chained them. I watched. I said nothing." Her voice was soft, but the words cut through the house like a blade. "You think I freed you, but I was the reason you were bound." Moses stepped closer. Her confession was not redemption, it was surrender. A lifetime of guilt finally surfacing like oil from the riverbed. Outside, thunder rolled. The rain came down hard, but it couldn't drown out her final words. "He's not haunting you, Moses," she said. "He's haunting me, through you." And for the first time, Moses saw it too, a shadow behind her flickering like a man reborn in flame. If guilt could speak, would you dare listen? The river behind the Godfrey plantation had always been a place of quiet dread. Its dark, slow-moving waters swallowed everything: secrets, bodies, prayers. Long before Moses was born, the locals called it Bayou du Silence. They said it carried the souls of the forgotten straight into the swamps where even God would not look. After Eleanor's confession, the nightmares began. Each night, Moses dreamed of the river, rising higher, closer, its surface rippling with pale faces just beneath. He would wake drenched in sweat, the sound of rushing water echoing in his ears. Then, one morning, the dreams crossed into daylight. Workers came running from the edge of the cane field, shouting. The river had receded after a long drought, revealing what lay beneath: bones. Dozens of them. Skulls cracked open by time, rib cages twisted among the reeds. Some of the older slaves recognized the burial ground immediately. "Runaway graves," one muttered. "He buried them here." The ones who fought back. Charles Godfrey had always said the river was bottomless, and now Moses knew why. The sheriff came, took one look, and left without saying a word. Too many ghosts for one man to question. By sunset, the site was cordoned off, but the workers refused to go near it. They claimed to hear voices coming from the bones, whispers that spoke their names. That night, Moses stood by the riverbank alone. The air was thick, wet, and heavy with decay. He knelt beside one of the exposed skeletons and brushed away the mud. There, half buried in the silt, he found a rusted shackle, a piece of iron once meant to hold flesh. And then, a voice, not from behind, not from within, but around him. "You took his place," it said. "You became what you killed." The wind carried it through the reeds, each word indistinguishable from the next, yet perfectly understood. Moses stumbled back, the old guilt clawing its way up his throat. He had thought killing the master freed him. But what if it had only passed the curse along, from one man's cruelty to another's control? When he returned to the house, Eleanor was gone. Her black dress was found at the river's edge, soaked and torn, but there was no body. Only footprints, small, bare, and leading into the water. Moses stared at the rippling surface until dawn, and for a moment he saw her face below, eyes open, lips moving, as if whispering his name from beneath the current. "If the river called to you, would you answer?" The night Eleanor vanished, the house began to breathe again. Doors that had long stayed shut began to creak open on their own. The air turned colder, heavy with the scent of damp earth and iron. Even the lamps refused to stay lit for long. Their flames sputtered and died as if smothered by unseen hands. Moses stopped sleeping. He spent his nights pacing the corridors, the floorboards groaning under his weight. Every mirror in the house began to warp, faces appearing behind his reflection, shifting, flickering. Sometimes the voice that came was hers, Sometimes it wasn't. Then, one night, as thunder rolled across the horizon, he heard it. That slow, deliberate sound of boots against the wooden floor. He froze. The sound came from the direction of the study, where no one had entered. Since the fire, the smell of tobacco and brandy hung thick in the air, though no candle burned. Moses entered slowly, every step echoing in the hollow house. The chair, his chair, sat by the window, turned slightly, just as it had on that night years ago. And then he heard the voice. "Still pretending you're master here?" The words were calm, familiar, soaked in arrogance and venom. Moses spun around, but there was no one. Only shadows trembling in the lightning's brief flash. The voice came again, closer this time. "You wear my coat. You sleep in my bed. You take my wife." A pause. "And you think the land forgives?" The window burst open. Rain slashed through the room as the chair began to rock on its own. Moses reached for it, and the cold hit him, sharp and biting, like a hand closing around his throat. For an instant, he saw him, Charles Godfrey, pale and grinning, his neck slashed open, his eyes alive with hatred. Moses fell back, gasping, his heart pounding against his ribs. When the lightning flashed again, the figure was gone. But the floorboards were wet, streaked with muddy footprints leading toward the hall. The next morning, the workers found the fields flattened, as if trampled by dozens of feet. No storm had passed, no wind had blown, yet the cane lay crushed. And near the riverbank, burned into the mud, were initials. C.G. Moses said nothing. He only stood there, staring at the ground, knowing that whatever he'd killed that night years ago had finally found its way home. If vengeance had a face, would you recognize it as your own? By the time winter came, the plantation had turned into a mausoleum. The once bright corridors now dripped with condensation. Every candle flame burned low, as if suffocating in the damp. The few workers who remained avoided the main house altogether, crossing themselves when they passed by. They whispered that Moses had lost his mind, talking to ghosts, wandering the fields at night, muttering to the air as if answering questions no one else could hear. But Moses was not mad. He knew what haunted him. The line between the living and the dead had thinned to nothing, and he could feel them, watching, judging, waiting. It began on the night of the first frost. He woke to the sound of chains dragging down the hallway. The clatter grew louder, closer, until it stopped just outside his bedroom door. When he opened it, he saw them, a procession of figures cloaked in shadow, faces hidden beneath white veils of smoke. In their midst walked Charles Godfrey, head tilted, eyes burning with something more than hatred, recognition. Behind him came Eleanor, pale and silent, her wedding veil soaked and torn, her hand clutching the blood-stained letter. Moses stepped back, trembling. The air grew heavy, suffocating. The figures formed a circle around him. The slaves who had died, the overseers who had vanished, the ones the land itself had devoured. Every face was familiar, every wound remembered. "This is your trial," the voice said, though it wasn't clear whose mouth it came from. "You killed the man who enslaved you, but you built his throne again. You ruled with silence, just as he ruled with pain." Moses fell to his knees. "I tried to set them free," he whispered. A figure stepped forward, Samuel, the field hand who had drowned in the river. His eyes were blank, his lips unmoving, but the words came anyway. "Freedom without forgiveness is still a cage." The walls trembled. The portraits fell. The sound of weeping filled the hall, centuries of grief spilling from the walls themselves. Moses screamed, covering his ears, but the voices only grew louder. When he looked up, Eleanor was standing before him, reaching out her hand. "It's time," she said. "The land takes back what it gave." And then came silence, deep, infinite silence. The next morning, the house was empty. The doors hung open, the hearth cold. Only a trail of wet footprints led from the parlor to the river. If judgment came for you tonight, would you beg for mercy or confess? Years passed, and the Godfrey plantation fell into ruin. Vines crept up the cracked columns. The roof sagged beneath the weight of rain, and the fields grew wild, untended, untamed. Travelers passing through Louisiana spoke of it in hushed tones, calling it the house that wouldn't die. No one dared settle there. Some swore the land itself breathed, that at night the cane swayed even when the wind stood still. They said Moses was gone, vanished like smoke. but others claimed he still walked the grounds at dusk, his shadow long and thin against the dying light. A man in a tattered coat, eyes like burning coals, standing by the riverbank where his wife had disappeared, waiting, listening. In 1863, during the war, Union soldiers stumbled upon the plantation. They found no living soul, only remnants of a world long dead. Plates set for dinner, a piano coated in ash, and a rusted shackle nailed to the wall like a relic. In the master's study, they discovered something stranger still, a ledger written in two hands, one in elegant cursive, one in heavy, deliberate strokes. The entries told the story of two lives intertwined by violence and guilt. The final line, dated the night of the fire, read simply, "The land chooses its master. It always has." The soldiers buried the book near the river and left by sunrise. None ever spoke of what they saw again, but stories spread through the towns, through the generations. They said the soil around the Godfrey lands grew sweeter than any other, that the sugarcane there shimmered in moonlight like silver blades. Some took it as a blessing. The old folks called it blood remembering blood. Even now, when the fog rolls in thick from the bayou, locals swear they hear the sound of boots on wood, a deep voice carried on the wind. Orders, prayers, confessions, no one can tell. The house still stands, broken but defiant, a monument to power's cruel symmetry, and somewhere within those walls, they say two shadows remain, one tall and dark, one pale and veiled, circling each other through endless time. Bound not by love nor hate, but by the soil that devoured them both. The slaves once sang of freedom, but freedom bought in blood comes with a price. So tell me, the narrator's voice fades into the rustle of the cane. If the world gave you the chance to rise above your master and rule the land that once broke you, would you take it? Or would you fear what it might make of you?